Welcome to Rails Around York. My name is Tom Hires. I'm a conductor on the Northern Central Railroad out of New Freedom.
The story starts back in about 1828, as I recall, when the merchants of Baltimore and the vicinity decided that they needed some outlets for their goods and to develop the port. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad was the first start on that, but soon thereafter they decided that there was a lot of benefit to building a railroad north into Pennsylvania. In fact, construction of the railroad began in 1829, a year after it was chartered. This made the Northern Central Railway predecessor company the second oldest railway in the United States. It's interesting to note that even though they had problems getting into Pennsylvania because of differences between the states, they were already into New Freedom by 1838 and into York as well.
That started as the Baltimore and Susquehanna, Ken. I believe in Pennsylvania the railroad picked up a different name because that went through the state legislation to get approval for that railroad. So basically, as it continued north, it was two separate railroads of the states, even though they were tied together. It was later on, I believe, that it all merged together and formed the Northern Central.
And that was the first time that that name came about.
Right, when it all merged together.
By the Civil War, the line was already completed well up into central and northern Pennsylvania, and in fact had started to acquire a number of branches. In fact, the Northern Central was a critical item during the Gettysburg campaign. It's interesting that Abraham Lincoln was, as I like to say, almost a commuter on that railroad. He first came down for his inaugural in 1861. Right. The original plan was to run him on the Pennsy out to Philadelphia and then down, but there was an assassination plot that was found out. And so instead, he came down to Northern Central, changed stations in Baltimore in the middle of the night, and proceeded safely into the capital. He also rode the Northern Central twice to confer with his generals during the Gettysburg campaign. And of course, the famous journey when he changed trains at Hanover Junction to the Hanover Junction Railway to give the Gettysburg Address.
That was the big one.
The final trip that we're aware of was when his remains were carried to their final resting place in Illinois for the last time.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't George Pullman make the car that Lincoln's body was transported in? I believe that was the first Pullman car manufactured.
I believe that's the case. It was originally considered too heavy for a lot of the railroads at the time, and being able to use it on the train bringing his remains back was kind of the impetus that put Pullman into the sleeping car business in a big way.
Right, and I believe Mrs. Lincoln retained that car after his death and the use of it.
Oh, I wasn't aware of that. I had heard that she had requested the use of that car specifically.
Yeah, and that was the start of the Pullman Company, if I'm not mistaken, also, which is kind of interesting because that all comes back to our current company.
Yes.
But after the Civil War is also when traffic grew out of the Pennsylvania coal mines and the farm fields up here in York County and along the Susquehanna, which is why they had to do the double tracking.
Oh yeah, that was what, about 1868 as I recall.
Right, double tracking, which is also when they widened Howard Tunnel.
Right. Howard Tunnel is interesting. It's not very long. It's only about 300 foot, but it is, as far as we are aware, the oldest railroad tunnel in the country. And by 1868, as you say, had already been widened. One of the interesting sidelights here is the fact that when they double-tracked the Northern Central, one of the single-track bridges that they replaced actually went over and was purchased by the Stewartstown Railroad, and they've got a railroad that was built in 1885 with a bridge that was built
Before the railroad.
Before the railroad. Yeah. Of course, somewhere in that time frame was when the Pennsylvania Railroad actually acquired control of the Northern Central.
I could be mistaken, but I believe the Pennsy was like the big brother to the Northern Central through the latter part of the last century. And through stock issues and what have you, they did eventually attain control of the Northern Central, I believe, around 1914.
It's interesting, though, in many cases they still allowed some semblance of the Northern Central name, even though it was a wholly owned company by that point, which kind of gives it its individuality, and I think endears it to the residents of the county.
Yeah, but the Pennsylvania Railroad influence was being strongly felt
Yes.
long before the final control.
Yeah.
There were a lot of locomotive and equipment leases from the Pennsylvania Railroad, which helped the Northern Central continue to grow, even, for that matter.
Yeah, certainly by the turn of the century, the Northern Central, even though it had a separate name, was essentially another part of the vast Pennsylvania Railroad system.
Pretty much. Absolutely.
And I believe it was around 1925 or so that the original Liberty Limited train was first put on. The Pennsy was a little bit concerned that the B&O was getting the lion's share of the Washington to Chicago traffic with their Premier Capital Limited. Felt that they needed to put some kind of a service in that would be premier enough to capture some of that business. And the Northern Central was a perfect route to do that because it was a nice connection between the Pennsy main line out of Washington and Baltimore and the main line west at Harrisburg, cutting off quite a bit of mileage as opposed to going to Philadelphia or even going up the Port Deposit line along the Susquehanna River.
That's true. At that time, the Northern Central was its main route for the Liberty Limited to Chicago. The what's the branch that's still currently in use that Amtrak uses? What is that referred to? Comes on the east side out of Baltimore on up. I know you've traveled it under electric.
Well, that's now the Northeast Corridor.
Right, the Northeast Corridor.
Right.
Before the Northeast Corridor grew to the size and the usage that it currently is, the Northern Central was the mainstay route for the Liberty Limited.
In fact, Northern Central was the mainstay route for all the passenger trains. Unlike the Port Deposit line, which didn't have a lot of grades, the Northern Central, being an older railroad, had some fairly heavy grades and fairly heavy curves, but in terms of raw mileage, it was a faster route. So it was always the preferred route for passenger trains, and the long, heavy, slow freight trains would take the Port Deposit line.
Oh, is that why they ran that many passenger trains up here? I didn't know that.
In fact, this Pennsylvania Railroad schedule of 1956 shows that the Pennsylvania had quite a number of trains running the Northern Central, including the Premier Liberty Limited. And it's this era of 1940s and 50s that we're trying to recreate today, of course. Sorry, George, I didn't mean to interrupt. Go ahead with your
The thing I found so interesting about it all is my father and my grandfather and my great-grandfather actually grew up in Parkton along the Northern Central Railway. And I just remember stories as a little child growing up from my dad and my grandfather about how the Liberty Limited used to come pounding through there uphill with double-headed K4s.
Interesting.
It used to be quite the sight, and I think that is why train travel of the past has become so romantic. It's a good way to put it. It's that feeling that we're trying to recreate, I should say.
Well, certainly when we started looking at the Northern Central Railway, when it was kind of a glimmer in our eyes, all of a few months ago, that was one of the things that came to mind, is the fact that here in York County, a lot of people associated with the Pennsylvania Railroad. It seems as though everybody has an uncle or a grandfather or some relative that had worked for the Pennsy, and there's a strong and proud heritage here. I mean, New Freedom itself has been a railroad town for 160 years. And that's one of the things I think that caused us to decide, instead of running a nameless dinner train which has no representation of the past, kind of have a tribute to this proud heritage, this second oldest railroad in the country, and recreate a nostalgic ride through the past.
Fine tribute to the people who helped build the railroad. It seems as if the natives of the area in southern York County, the Pennsylvania Tuscan Red is in their blood.
Yeah, yes. I know we've gotten a number of very favorable comments from people about the fact that we've been able to be involved in bringing the train back. By the mid-50s, the Pennsylvania Railroad had had enough weakening of traffic, particularly the passenger business, where they started to single-track the line again. And during the 60s, it was primarily used for trailer on flat car trains, which also required high-speed use, but where there wasn't as much concern about the amount of horsepower needed to get a train over the road. Final undoing, though, was 1972 when Agnes hit.
I was out of the country. I'm sure many people will remember that storm, but I can honestly say I don't.
I was on vacation at the time and rushed back to get ahead of it. But I'm sure everybody in York County remembers it quite well. The thing that amazes me is that the Codorus Creek, which actually only starts in New Freedom is the headwaters, within a few short miles north of that had enough power and turbulence to take out several major stone bridges, including the famous Twin Arch Bridge. It certainly wreaked havoc on this piece of railroad.
North and south of the border.
Yes. It's interesting that while the majority of the damage was on the north end, since there was virtually no online business between Cockeysville and New Freedom, the south end was abandoned just as quickly as the north, even though it wasn't that badly damaged. The Stewartstown Railroad, which was the major online customer between Baltimore and New York, fought aggressively to keep the railroad from being abandoned, but was unsuccessful. And in 1970-something, it was finally abandoned and purchased by the state. Then in about 1982, 1983, local York County politicians were able to put together a program which allowed the railroad from New Freedom to York to be reconstructed, and the Stewartstown Railroad began operations in 1985.
10 long years.
Yes, and that was really the problem. The freight traffic, which had originally existed, by that time had largely dried up. Stewartstown made a go of it, though, until 1992, when it became increasingly apparent that the freight traffic wasn't ever going to come back. That and some fundamental differences about the concept of running a railroad alongside a trail are, I believe, what led to the Stewartstown finally going back to their own original railroad.
Their railroad is an interesting one. Runs from New Freedom over to Stewartstown, basically the original classic example of a farmer's railroad.
Yes.
Very, very nostalgic railroad because so much of it's still original.
Yeah. It's probably, next to the East Broadtop, one of the nicest, well-saved, well-preserved classic railroad operations around. After 1992, the Northern Central, of course, was unused except by some individuals who had privately owned speeders. And then
track inspection cars.
Right.
For the viewers.
Okay, sorry about that. And then back in December of 1995, we approached them with the concept of starting up a new railroad primarily based on passenger service and specifically a dinner train, the new Liberty Limited.
I remember that meeting very well. It was a very, very cold winter in '95, '96.
Yeah.
And it was an hour drive for me to go to that meeting. It was cold and dark, very icy conditions.
Suffice to say that things came together, and after agreeing on a lease arrangement with the county in May, we were able to get the Northern Central Railroad up and operating in about 7 weeks. We wanted very much to have the inaugural run of the new Liberty Limited dinner train coincide with the opening of the trail. And while the trail had taken 17 long years to get started, we were able to get everything up together in 7 weeks. It was kind of our shining moment, I'd say, at that point. It was actually running a train.
It's also a shining moment for the trail. One of the very few trails, if not the only one, with the train operating alongside of it.
Yeah, especially when one looks at the opportunity here for a coordinated rail-trail service. Our coach service is the only instance that I am aware where a coach train actually stops en route to pick up hikers and bikers so that they can do the downhill walk or ride and not have to come back and do the hard part. Or, if they choose, the other way around.
I wonder which will be the better seller.
Of course, the Liberty Limited was really the basis on which we founded the railroad, and that's, you know, the nostalgic look at the past, the 40s and 50s. That was a fascinating era in railroad history because that was the post-war boom in passenger traffic. The railroads were ready to commit with a lot of money for new streamlined equipment to try and get the traveling public back any way they could, and it was before they had conceded and surrendered that traffic to the airlines. And so you had some of the most glamorous cars, glamorous accommodations, and interesting services and features ever found in railroading. You had the combination of technology and service that just isn't possible anymore because of today's labor costs.
Hello, I'd like to welcome you to the Northern Central Railway. We're going to be going through and talking about the Liberty Limited, the new recreation of the famous passenger train that ran on this line during the first half of the century. My name is Ken Bitton. I'm the president of the Northern Central, and I'd like to invite you to be my guest to see what makes this dinner train tick. This is the second oldest car on the property. We're going to be using the car as a tool and storage car, but it was originally built as one of 125 cars for the Pennsylvania Railroad back in 1925. It's a classic heavyweight sleeper, originally built as a 12-section, one drawing room car. Very common, in fact, the most common arrangement of Pullman sleeping cars. Its history from there on is somewhat blurred. We picked it up the beginning of this year from the Gettysburg Railroad, and while we don't plan to restore this car in operating condition, it's quite an interesting car and in pretty good shape for its well over 65 years. The Madley, unlike most of our cars, is equipped with what are known as friction bearings. This is the type of wheel and axle system used by the railroad for over 100 years. Nowadays, it's mostly been superseded by roller bearings. But let's go in and see what makes it tick. As you may or may not be able to see, the axle, which is directly attached to the wheel itself, the wheel is actually pressed on, is sitting in the middle of what appears to be a box. This whole thing is known as a journal box. On top of the axle is a brass casting known as a journal brass, which is held in place by a wedge. The weight of the truck and therefore the weight of the whole car sits on top of the wedge. Now you may think to yourself, why wouldn't as the axle turns and the brass doesn't, why wouldn't this just burn up? Well, the secret to it is the fact that the brass is not actually sitting directly on the axle. There's a very thin layer of oil between the two. And if, in fact, that oil disappears, when the brass sits on the axle directly, it will start to heat up, it will melt, and then in a worst-case situation, we'll start grinding through the axle to the point where the whole end of the axle shears off, the truck drops down, and a derailment occurs. That was known as a hot box and was one of the worst disasters that a railroad could experience, as you can well imagine. The secret, again, is that thin layer of oil. And what keeps that oil there? Well, that's done by this wad of cotton. It used to be cotton waste, and now they're known as lube pads, that keeps the well of oil in the bottom soaked into the pad and keeps wiping the circumference of the axle so that there's always that critical layer of oil. And that, in a nutshell, is a friction bearing. Catalpa Falls is unique in that it is the only car on board today's Liberty Limited that was actually built for and used by the Pennsylvania Railroad. It was built in 1949 by Pullman for the Pennsy as a 6-bedroom lounge car and ran on the original Liberty Limited as well as the Broadway Limited and other famous Pennsylvania Railroad trains. We're pleased to have it as part of today's train. I see Catalpa Falls owner George Payne is here. Let's let him tell us a little bit of the history of this grand old lady.
The car Catalpa Falls was built in the spring of 1949 by the Pullman Company for the Pennsylvania Railroad Service. It's a 6-bedroom lounge, sleeps 12 people, has a lounge that seats 18 people. We bought the car in 1972 from the Penn Central Company. We've actually owned the car longer than the railroad has owned it. We have attempted to keep the car pretty much in the condition it was in when it was built, with the exception of a diesel generator that we've installed to run the lights, heating, and air conditioning. We're currently very happy to have it assigned in service on the Northern Central Railway. It's as close to home as it's been for us in probably 15 years.
This car is a good example of the revolution that occurred in the middle to late 30s when the Edward G. Budd Company turned the railroad industry, and particularly the car building industry, on its ear. The Pullman Company and several others were quite comfortable building their classic old heavyweight cars when the Budd Company perfected its shot weld process, allowing them to weld together pieces of stainless steel. Here was a car that never needed to be painted and never rusted out, and presented a beautiful appearance to the outside. Later on, Pullman Company, because they operated the sleeping cars as well as building them and owning them, was the subject of an antitrust suit from Budd Company, who complained that the railroads were being intimidated from buying sleeping cars because of pressure from Pullman. Once again, setting the railroad industry on its ear. This car, which is clearly still in the process of being rebuilt, will be part of that train. Originally built in 1950 for the Santa Fe, it was constructed by Pullman and was part of the tremendous fleet of trains that Santa Fe ran between Chicago and Los Angeles as part of their famed Super Chief and Chief fleet. This Reading caboose, built in 1941 for the Reading Railroad by their own Reading shops, went to Conrail before being purchased by private owner Richard Hafer and being carefully repaired and refurbished by him. These cabooses are presently unused. They're stored awaiting restoration. The two blue ones, obviously owned by Conrail in an earlier life, are owned by York County and being restored with the help of the Pennsylvania Railroad Technical and Historical Society. The third one is privately owned by Renee Bitton and is unusual in that it appears to be a wooden caboose, but is actually a steel underframe caboose with a wooden superstructure. It was built in 1943 during World War II, and due to the steel shortage, the actual siding and some of the framing was built out of wood to help the war effort. Nevertheless, it is a sound steel frame and capable of mainline operation were that to be desired. Our oldest piece of motive power on the Northern Central Railway is Western Maryland 1689. A very unusual locomotive. This is an Alco RSD5 and is one of only two known to exist today. It was originally built as Chicago Northwestern 1689 and has been privately owned for about 9 years. Both of the locomotives that the Northern Central Railway uses are leased from BK&E Engineering and Gary Balloon from the Midwest. The thing that makes this locomotive so unusual are the C trucks. These are, once again, six-wheel trucks, but they have 3 traction motors. The RS2 and RS3s that Alco built were far more common, but for specialized applications where you needed great tractive effort pulling a lot of cars on light rail, the RSD4s and RSD5s, and 1689 is an RSD5, were built in small numbers for a few railroads. This classic car body style locomotive heads up the Liberty Limited. Originally built in 1959 for the Canadian National Railway, it was eventually transferred to VIA and then sold into private ownership. It was built by Montreal Locomotive Works up in Canada under license to the American Locomotive Works, or American Locomotive Company, more commonly known as Alco. It's an FPA4, which is actually a freight locomotive with a steam boiler added for passenger service. It was, however, used only in passenger service, and this particular model of locomotive is unique to Canada. It's equipped with a 251 style engine and is rated for 1,800 horsepower. The process of getting ready for a run on the Northern Central is actually pretty fascinating. Let's take a walk through with Assistant Manager of Maintenance Donnie Cromer as he begins the process of inspecting Locomotive 800 and firing it up for the evening's train.
Okay, what we want to do here is you want to switch all your control panel switches on. Then you're going to wait for your fuel pressure to come up, and it's got to go to about 40 pounds of pressure, and then you come around this way. Okay, we're waiting for the fuel pressure to come up to 40 pounds of pressure. And back here on the back side of the panel, we have a start switch. Okay, we got our 40 pounds, and we're going to hold the switch in until we get 60 pounds on the oil pressure gauge. Then after you got all the switches, your fuel pressure's up, your locomotive's running, you want to make sure your amperage is okay. Right now we're showing a slight discharge, that's from starting. The amperage will then come out to 0. Then it'll be a positive charge, it'll be alright at that point. And then after that you want to check your fluid levels, which is your oil, your air compressor oil, and your water treatment level. They're all in the engine compartment, it's kind of noisy in there, so we'll stay out of there.
In addition to the basic starting process, federal law requires us to do an extensive inspection of the locomotive on a daily basis and keep records of that inspection, checking for defects, potential problems, and particularly areas that could affect railroad safety. Here's Liberty Limited Director of Onboard Service, Angie Homan. Angie will tell us a little bit about what it takes to get the Liberty Limited rolling down the tracks and get all of the passengers fed and watered and happy. Angie, why don't you take us through and show us some of the behind-the-scenes efforts that are involved in getting things going.
Okay, right this way.
Come on in behind the scenes here, and we'll deal with Leslie and her assistant, Shannon Seawald. Leslie, can we interrupt for a minute? What's on the menu for this evening's train?
Well, tonight we have a ragout of beef tenderloin. We also have fusilli with asparagus and mushrooms, and we're also having lemon pepper chicken that's on our buffet. And for private dining, we're having chicken parmesan and baked ham.
And what's for dessert?
We're having a fruit compote with a gingered orange sauce.
Wow, that sounds great. Thanks for letting us sneak in.
I'd like to welcome you to the Liberty Limit again. I'm Angela, the onboard services manager, and this is part of my onboard services staff. We have Jeff, Megan, Barb, Christine, Bob, Lori, Kelly, and Kim. Kelly and Kim are our bussers. The rest of these are bartenders and waitresses. As you can see, we're trying to stay with the traditional 1940s railroad service attire with the long aprons and the jackets and the ties. Their duties on here are as service personnel and bartenders. We're all fairly new at this. None of us have ever really worked on a train before, so learning how to walk on the train and serve coffee while it's leaning and running has all been a wonderful experience for all of us. This is the lounge in one of our private dining cars. We're using this lounge as service for appetizers or hors d'oeuvres, whatever the chef may have on the menu that week. We're offering that our private dining people come together and mingle a little bit and get to know each other before they go and before the train actually starts moving and we start serving dinner in their private rooms. This week we happen to have fruit and cheese and crackers, and we've also displayed a few of our wine and champagne selections that are on our menu right now.
You chose to follow others around the crossing gate. This is the next 60 seconds of your life.
Let's go. Come on, let's go. There's no train. Let's go.
I'm going.
No. America's roads can be highways or dieways. The choice is yours.
train into York ran in August of 1838, came up from Baltimore, and they had a station at Grantley Street, and then they later moved to Market and Water. Now the last station that Pennsylvania had, I believe the carpet firm's in there now, on North Duke Street. That was opened July 1st, 1890. Another thing not many people in York realize, they had quite an illustrious visitor in 1842. Charles Dickens, of course, we know, wrote Dickens' Christmas Carol. He took a tour of the United States. I think he landed in Boston, went down to Philadelphia, visited Washington and Baltimore, and then he went west. He came up by train on the Baltimore and Susquehanna Railroad, which only then went as far as York. And in the book he tells about riding this train and the sparks burning his clothing and so forth. Then he gets to York, and then he had to transfer to a stagecoach. Well, this fastidious English gentleman wasn't used to the rigors of American travel, and he gets on this stagecoach, and I guess somewhere up, might be as far as Strines Town, or maybe even further. They must have, but it was a stop. They stopped at taverns. Well, I think most of the customers got in the tavern and stayed too long, and they came out, and they were pretty well under the weather. And Charles Dickens, well, he didn't like the people were smoking cigars and chewing tobacco in the stagecoach, so he gets up on the roof, or what they call the box, with the driver. He rode up with him, and he said, all of a sudden there was a stirring under this, must have been a tarp to cover the baggage. Well, here was the driver's son. He was riding along just for the ride to Harrisburg. And then, of course, he was horrified because when they got to Harrisburg, or the West Shore, as we call it, going down, later known as the bottleneck, there was a covered bridge called the Camelback Bridge. Well, this stagecoach must have shot down there with the speed of light. He was on top of this box, and he saw this covered bridge coming. He thought, boy, that was the end of him, and oh, how bad it was. And then he got to Harrisburg. Then he tells the story of riding a canal boat those days up to Hollidaysburg and over the Portage Railroad, and oh, the kind of food they had in the canal boat, how bad it was. And then in the morning, I guess to wash, they just dumped a bucket down into the water and washed that way. And he was, the fastidious English gentleman wasn't used to our way of life in this country. And I tell you, anybody should go to a library. It's not a common, one of these common works. It's called My American Notes. And it really does a wonderful picture of American life and society in that period. And he was, it goes on, he goes out to Pittsburgh. I forget where he goes beyond there, but tells all the people he met and what the country was like and so forth. Then in 1854, the Baltimore and Susquehanna was acquired by a railroad called the Northern Central. Now the Northern Central eventually became quite a system. It ran from Harrisburg, or Baltimore, to Harrisburg, and then it went up to Elmira, and up to Rochester. Finally hit the Great Lakes. And that was independent for many years. The Northern Central, that was one of what they call one of the least lines of Pennsylvania. In other words, Pennsylvania Railroad, period, only ran from, well, originally from Harrisburg to Pittsburgh. Then they acquired the Philadelphia and Columbia and added that. And then they operated the Northern Central as a leased line. In fact, when I was small, I remember some of the coaches that we run over to York, but at Pennsylvania Railroad on the outside, but inside above the door would say NCRR. In other words, it was a lease of 999 years or something like that. In later years, or earlier years, you had the cars were lettered Northern Central, and the engines were lettered Northern Central. But gradually, after 1870, well, even later in the 90s, they were lettered Northern Central, and it was always referred to that. And then in 1976, the whole Pennsylvania system went into Conrail. And then, of course, by that time, the Northern Central Corporation was then dissolved. And of course, with that, your name, Pennsylvania Railroad, as such, disappeared from the scene. And one of the things that with York here, you had a funny situation with divisions. You had a Baltimore division, trains coming up from Baltimore to York, to Harrisburg, and then for some unusual reason, trains from York to Columbia and over to Frederick were the Maryland division, and also down the Port Road. And of course, Columbia was the Philadelphia division. And before we got into standard time, I forget the date when we went to standard time, I think it was 82 or 83, but before that, I guess if you worked on the railroad, York might have had to carry 3 different watches because the Philadelphia division ran on Philadelphia time. Frederick division, well, I think above York, they ran on Harrisburg time. On the Maryland or the Baltimore division ran on Baltimore time, which was a couple of difference. They reckoned time of when the sun got above the town hall or the Capitol building. You had quite an extensive train service through York. Up and down the line from Baltimore to Harrisburg, you had about, I would say at least on a weekday basis, at least 15 trains in each direction. Plus you had the line from Columbia to York, to Frederick, and they had about, well, Columbia to York had about 6 trains a day, and there were 3 trains a day to Frederick. And yes, the sleeper, that I have that schedule over in the file there. They left. You got, well, I think you could get on the. I'll tell you that I remember faintly the sleeper used to be. They'd park it right where the station is on the east side of the Duke Street. And there it would lay. Well, all right, you'd buy a ticket, there'd be a porter, and they would open the car around 10 o'clock. And then the train train from Baltimore picked that car up. They apparently come through and stick it on the end of the train, take you to Harrisburg, and it laid there about 2 or 3 hours. And then it put on a train to New York. And you got into New York about 6 o'clock in the morning, but you could stay in the sleeper till 8 o'clock.
Roger, we're going to open up coaches on the trail set. Our trainman's waiting to do it. Tom to George, we do that after we couple, right? We're not going to load till after we couple.
my train legs in from yesterday. I'm falling over right.
Thank you for watching Rails Around York. We welcome your phone calls and comments. Call WRCT at 843-7722. We hope you enjoyed this program.
Good night.
Rails Around York is a Good Day production.